People always assume that a quiet woman has nothing to say. They mistake stillness for weakness, patience for submission, and a soft voice for the absence of power. My name is Vivienne Ashford. I am 34 years old. For 7 years, I was what the world called a devoted wife. I cooked. I maintained a home that most people would call a manor. I raised our daughter with every ounce of love I had. And I watched, in careful silence, while my husband Daniel climbed a career he believed he had built himself, without ever understanding who had laid the foundation beneath his feet. The morning he told me our marriage was over, he was wearing cufflinks I had chosen for him at a boutique in Milan. He stood in the kitchen of a house that had been in my family for 2 generations, poured himself coffee from a machine I had ordered in a kitchen I had designed, and he told me, with the casual cruelty of someone who has never once feared consequence, that he was in love with someone else. Her name was Brittany. She was 22. She worked in the marketing department at Meridian Venture Partners, the mid-market private equity firm where Daniel served as director of business development. He told me she was vivacious, ambitious, and full of life, as if those words were a verdict on everything I was not. I set down the dish towel I was holding, folded it neatly over the handle of the oven door, and looked at my husband with the kind of clarity that only comes to a person who has known the truth long before anyone had the courage to say it out loud. I already knew about Brittany. I had known for 4 months. What Daniel did not know was who I actually was. Before we go on, if you're enjoying the story so far, tap that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. Thank you. Let me explain something about private family trusts and how the serious ones are structured, because this matters. My father's name was Gerald Weston. Gerald Weston built the Weston Family Trust over 40 years, starting from a small real estate holding company in Connecticut and expanding it into a diversified portfolio valued, at the time of his passing 18 months before that morning in the kitchen, at just over $2.3 billion. My father was a deeply private man. He believed that real wealth does not announce itself, and he applied that philosophy not just to his personal habits, but to the legal architecture of everything he built. The Weston Family Trust does not appear anywhere in any company registry under that name. It operates through a layered structure of holding companies and nominee arrangements that my father's attorneys spent 20 years refining for precisely this purpose, to allow the trust to own things without the word Weston appearing in any document that an ordinary due diligence process would surface. The top-level entity that holds the trust's private equity interests is called Hargrove Capital Management, LLC, registered in Delaware, with a listed manager who is a longtime, trusted associate of my father's legal team. Hargrove, in turn, holds its positions through 2 intermediate vehicles. The beneficial ownership of Hargrove traces back to the trust only through a chain of documentation that requires specific legal standing to access. I tell you this not to excuse what Daniel did not know, but to explain why he did not know it, because the alternative explanation, that he was simply careless, is both true and insufficient, and I have no interest in making this story simpler than it actually was. Daniel knew that Meridian Venture Partners had a significant institutional investor. He knew this investor was represented on the board by Raymond Chu, a composed and methodical man who had been one of my father's closest professional associates for 25 years. He knew that this investor had a long-term passive posture toward Meridian, that it rarely intervened in operational decisions, and that its presence was a sign of stability and backing rather than scrutiny. What he did not know was that the trail from Hargrove Capital Management to the Weston Family Trust, to me, ran through exactly the kind of legal structure that a director of business development at a mid-market firm would have no reason to investigate and no standing to access, even if he had tried. He had read his employment contract carefully enough to understand his compensation, his equity, and his non-compete provisions. He was not a careless man in the ordinary sense of the word. He was, however, a man who had never developed the habit of questioning the ground he stood on, because in his experience, the ground had always held. That is a different kind of carelessness, and in my observation, it is far more common and far more dangerous than the simple kind. My father had one reservation when I asked him, 3 months after our wedding, to find a genuine role for Daniel within one of the Trust's portfolio companies. He sat across from me at the dining table in his house in Greenwich and told me that Daniel was talented in a specific and limited way, that he was excellent at relationships and presentations and the theater of business, and that these were real and marketable skills, but that they were skills of surface rather than depth, and that men of surface tended to mistake the applause they received for their own reflection in it. I told my father he was being uncharitable. He told me he hoped I was right. He arranged for Hargrove to facilitate Daniel's introduction to Meridian's leadership, a warm referral with just enough weight behind it to open the right doors. And Daniel walked through those doors with the confidence of a man who believed his own charm had opened them. He was not entirely wrong. His charm was real. The introduction was just also real, and it came from somewhere he could not see. Over the following 6 years, Daniel became genuinely good at his role. I want to be accurate about this because fairness matters to me more than it perhaps serves the cleaner version of this story. He was not a fraud. He worked hard. He built real relationships with portfolio company founders and with limited partners who liked his energy and his ability to make complex things sound approachable. He was genuinely talented at reading a room, at making people feel they had been understood, which is rarer than it sounds and has real commercial value. He received his promotions on the basis of actual performance reviews, not just through invisible intervention. He closed deals that other people had failed to close. He retained relationships that had been on the verge of souring. These were real contributions, and the colleagues who valued him accurately for what he actually did well. What he never fully understood was the structural context that made his performance possible. The quality of deal flow he had access to, calibrated invisibly by Hargrove's strategic interests. The doors that opened in certain rooms because Raymond Chu had quietly indicated that this person had the Trust's implicit endorsement. The particular deference that serious, well-informed people showed him at industry events, a deference he received not because they knew his wife specifically, but because they sensed, at some level they could not always articulate, that there was institutional weight behind him that did not fully show on his business card. He interpreted all of this as the natural consequence of his own ability. That was not an insane interpretation. It was just incomplete. A man who has always been handed good lumber will eventually become a skilled carpenter and will, quite reasonably, attribute his skill to his own hands. He is not wrong. He is also not seeing the full picture. The incomplete interpretation was something I had, in the early years, gently tried to address. I had suggested more than once that he develop a deeper relationship with Raymond Chu, that he ask Raymond directly about the broader investor context, that he spend some time with the corporate structure documents Meridian filed annually with its regulators. Daniel would nod, agree it was a good idea, and then pivot to something more immediately engaging. He was, at his core, a man of the present tense. The details that did not directly affect this quarter's pipeline were details for another day, which in practice meant they were details for never. I stopped suggesting. I noted the pattern, the way you note a small structural crack in a wall that is not yet load-bearing, and I moved on. I made 3 phone calls the morning after Daniel delivered his speech about Brittany and new beginnings. The first was to Margaret Calloway, who had handled my family's legal affairs for over a decade and who had drafted the prenuptial agreement Daniel had signed before our wedding. He had read it carefully, or so he believed. The agreement was 31 pages long. Most of those pages dealt with the protection of his personal assets and his future earning capacity in the event of divorce, provisions that were generous and straightforward and that he had found reassuring. On page 24, in a section titled Professionally Derived Assets and Interests, there was a clause that stated, in the precise language that Margaret spent 6 weeks calibrating, that any professional position, compensation, equity interest, or career advancement obtained during the term of the marriage through the direct or indirect facilitation of the Weston Family Trust or its affiliated entities would be subject to trust jurisdiction upon dissolution of the marriage, and that the terms of any employment arrangement falling within this category would revert to the discretion of the trust's chairwoman, who is identified by name as Vivienne Elaine Weston. Margaret had placed this clause where she placed it deliberately. She was not hiding it. It was in the agreement, in standard legal English, available to any attorney Daniel chose to consult. The attorney Daniel had used to review the prenup was a friend of his from law school who specialized in entertainment contracts and who had been, by Daniel's own account, hungover for much of the review process. I had suggested at the time that Daniel might want to engage someone more specialized. He had told me I was overthinking it. I had said nothing further. I told Margaret that the dissolution was underway and that it was time to begin. She said she would have the initial filings ready by end of week. The second call was to Raymond Chu. I told him what I am about to tell you, plainly and without drama, and asked him to follow the protocol we had established in writing 18 months earlier, when my father's estate was finalized and the trust's governance transferred entirely to me. Raymond said he would have everything prepared by close of business. The third call was to the property management company handling the West Village building where Brittany was living. The building was one of 11 residential properties owned by a Hargrove subsidiary. That conversation lasted 4 minutes. Daniel arrived at his office at 8:45 that morning. He greeted the receptionist, took the elevator to the 12th floor, settled into his chair with the ease of a man at home in his domain. He had 3 meetings scheduled: a call with a portfolio company at 9, a strategy review at 10:30, a lunch with a potential LP at noon. He completed exactly one of them. At 9:51, Raymond Chu entered Daniel's office without knocking. He was accompanied by the head of HR and Patricia Steele, Meridian's general counsel. Raymond placed an envelope on the desk. Inside was a termination letter, signed by the full board, effective immediately, citing a governance review under the direction of the firm's primary institutional investor, triggering the relevant clause of Daniel's employment agreement. There was also a separation document. Its terms were not what Daniel would have expected. They reflected, with accuracy, the provisions he had not read carefully enough. Daniel argued. He said there had been no performance review warranting this action. He said he had allies on the board. He said he would retain counsel. Raymond told him that the materials in the envelope contained everything his counsel would need, and that the board's decision was unanimous, and that it had been reached through proper process, and that there was nothing further to discuss at this time. Daniel's access credentials were deactivated at 10:03. Security accompanied him to the elevator. He left the building at 10:17 carrying a box with a coffee mug, a framed photograph, and 4 years of business cards. Outside on the sidewalk in the October air, he stood for a moment with the box in his arms. I know this because someone who worked in the building across the street saw him standing there and mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance some weeks later. She said he looked less angry than stunned, like a man trying to remember the last time he had checked the ground beneath his feet and realizing he could not. He called me at 11:40. I let it go to voicemail. The message was not calm. It cycled through several stages in approximately 3 minutes. Accusation, denial that this was connected to our separation, a theory that Raymond Chu had orchestrated something personal against him. Then, near the end, a register I had not often heard from Daniel, something quieter and more frightened, a version of his voice that sounded like a man beginning to understand that the structure he had been living inside was not the structure he had believed it to be. I listened to the message once. I set the phone down on the garden table next to my cup of tea and sat for a while watching the light on my mother's flowers. He called again at 1:15, again at 2:40. At 3:10 he arrived at the front door. I opened it myself. He stood on the steps of the house he had lived in for 6 years, and before the anger returned to his face, there was a moment of something else. Genuine disorientation, the kind that comes from stepping off a surface you had never once thought to examine. He said he wanted to talk. I told him that anything he needed to communicate could go through Margaret Calloway's office. He said he had rights to this house, that he had lived here, contributed to it, that I could not simply exclude him. I told him, as gently as I could, that the house had been held in a trust predating our marriage by 14 years, that his name had never appeared on the deed, and that Margaret would be forwarding the documentation to his attorney by end of day. He looked at me for a long moment. He said he had not known. I told him I was aware of that. He said he had been at this firm for 6 years and no one had ever indicated. I said that was accurate. He said he wished I had told him. I considered that for a moment. I thought about the times I had suggested he look more carefully, the attorney he had not engaged, the conversations we had not had, the 7 years of a marriage in which he had never once asked me, with genuine curiosity, what my life had been before I was his wife. I thought about Brittany. I said that Margaret's office would be in touch. I closed the door. What came next was quieter than I expected, and in some ways, more painful. Because the thing about wielding a structure you have spent years quietly maintaining is that when it finally does its work, you are still there afterward, in the silence of your own home. And the outcome, if that is even the right word, is clean and hollow in equal measure. I had expected to feel something more definitive. What I felt instead was tired in a way that sleep did not address, a tiredness that belonged not to the day, but to the accumulated weight of the 7 years preceding it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained watchfulness, from the habit of knowing more than you are saying and saying less than you know. And it does not dissolve the moment the situation that produced it resolves. It stays in the body for a while. You have to let it work its way out. Brittany left the West Village apartment within 48 hours, before the formal lien had even been processed, which told me she had understood the situation faster than Daniel had. She was 22 years old, and she had assessed, with the swift pragmatism of someone who has never been in a position to rely on anything permanent, that the man she had chosen for his apparent access and stability had lost both in a single morning, and that there was nothing left in the arrangement worth staying for. She sent Daniel a text. I never saw it, but I heard it described as brief and final, with no expression of regret. She relocated to Austin 6 weeks later. I did not wish her harm. She had been young and calculating, which I found far less contemptible than the deliberate betrayal of someone who had promised to love you and meant it for a while, and then chose something easier. The divorce proceedings lasted 6 months. Daniel's legal team was good, genuinely good, and they made several substantive arguments about the contribution of his professional reputation and network to the appreciation of trust-adjacent assets during the marriage. These arguments were not frivolous. Margaret took them seriously. She engaged 2 economists and a forensic accountant to produce a counter-analysis, and the counter-analysis was unambiguous. The prenuptial agreement was unambiguous. The employment contract was unambiguous. The property records were unambiguous. What Daniel's attorneys could not overcome was the fact that the documents Daniel had signed were not predatory or concealed. They were available, in plain language, to anyone who read them with appropriate care. The judge noted this specifically in her ruling. She granted the divorce on the terms the agreement specified. She granted me sole custody with generous visitation for Daniel, which I had not contested, because whatever he was to me, he was still her father, and she deserved that relationship if she wanted it. When the custody ruling was announced, Daniel dropped his head. His attorneys placed hands on his shoulders. He was not the man I had married in that moment. He was a man who had dismantled something real and durable and was only now beginning to understand what it had actually been. There is a moment I return to often, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the one moment in all of this that felt genuinely human in a way that the legal proceedings and the strategic maneuvering did not. It happened 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I was in my father's study, working through quarterly reports, and my daughter came in and climbed into the leather reading chair beside my desk and leaned her head against my shoulder without saying anything. After a while, she asked if everything was going to be all right. I told her yes. She asked how I knew. I thought about the garden outside. I thought about the house that had stood through my grandmother's death and my mother's illness and my father's slow, dignified decline. I thought about my father telling me once, when I was about her age, that the most durable form of security was not wealth or status or even love, all of which could be taken or transformed into something unrecognizable. He said the most durable thing was knowing exactly who you were, beneath all the roles and the relationships, knowing it so thoroughly that no one else's assessment of you could actually alter it. I told my daughter that I knew everything was going to be all right because we were in our home, and we had everything we needed, and the people who mattered knew the truth, and the rest would take care of itself. She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to drawing horses in her spiral notebook, curled up in my father's chair, and I sat across from her in the yellow afternoon light and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the space around me was exactly the right size. What I struggled with more than I had expected was the question of the disclosure. Not legally, that had been handled, but personally. There were women in my life, friends, a therapist I saw for about a year after the divorce, my daughter's school counselor who gently suggested that the stability of the household had been an evident source of comfort for her, who all at different points and in different registers asked me some version of the same question. Why had I not told him? Why had I let 7 years pass without laying out the full picture for my own husband? I have tried in the years since to answer this honestly rather than defensively. The honest answer is layered, and none of its layers are entirely flattering to me. The first layer is that I had genuinely tried, in the early years, to build a life that was not defined by the Weston name or the Weston assets. A life in which love was the organizing principle, rather than inheritance. This was not dishonest. It came from something real. The second layer is that my father had advised me, on more than one occasion, to let a marriage develop without the weight of that disclosure until I was certain of the person I had chosen, and that I had trusted his judgment, and perhaps also used it as cover for an avoidance that was partly my own. The third layer, the one that took me longest to look at directly, is that somewhere in the middle years of the marriage, when I had started to see Daniel more clearly, I stopped raising it not out of love or strategy, but out of a kind of exhausted resignation. I had offered him chances to look more carefully, and he had declined them. And after enough declined invitations, you stop extending them, and you start, quietly, preparing for a different outcome. A therapist would probably have a name for this. I think of it simply as the point at which hope becomes something else, still functional, still forward-looking, but no longer tethered to the specific person who let it run out. I stepped back into the chairmanship of the Weston Family Trust formally 12 weeks after the divorce was finalized. My first major initiative was to establish a fellowship program for women returning to professional life after extended periods of caregiving. Women who had made similar choices to mine, who had stepped aside from visibility and needed not charity, but structural support and the kind of institutional access that the trust was well positioned to provide. I funded it at $8 million and named it after my mother. It is now, several years later, one of the most regarded programs of its kind in the country, having supported over 400 women in rebuilding and redirecting their professional lives. I mention this not as a credential, but as a context, because I think it matters for understanding what I took from all of this. Not just the personal dimensions, the marriage and the betrayal and the legal resolution, but the broader thing, the structural reality of what happens when intelligent, capable women organize their lives around the success of someone else and then discover that the someone else has not been paying sufficient attention to understand what they actually had. The fellowship exists because I believe that the waste involved in that pattern is enormous and largely invisible, and that institutions are better positioned than individuals to interrupt it. The trust has that capacity. My mother would have used it this way. I am certain of that. What happened with Daniel did not make me bitter. It made me clear. There is a difference between those two things that I think is important to hold on to. Bitterness is a kind of remaining at the site of the wound. Clarity is movement. It is understanding that what happened revealed something true, and that the right response to truth is not to flinch from it, but to act on it intelligently. I had one more conversation with Daniel, about 18 months after the divorce, at a charity dinner we both happened to attend. We found ourselves briefly in the same exchange at the reception with two other people who knew us both and who found reasons to drift away quickly. We stood there with our glasses of sparkling water, which had always been one of the real things we shared, the not drinking, and he looked at me with an expression that was harder to read than any he had shown me during the legal process. He said, after a moment, that he supposed I had been within my rights to handle things the way I had. I said I was glad he thought so. He said that he had not understood the full picture, which was true, and which I acknowledged. He said that he wished he had asked more questions earlier about a lot of things, and his voice when he said this had the particular quality of someone who has recently and reluctantly arrived at something honest about themselves. I said I thought that was probably right. Then there was a silence that held everything that neither of us was going to say, all the years and the choices and the specific series of moments in which two people who might have built something real instead built something that only functioned in the dark. And then dinner was announced, and we both nodded and walked toward our tables in opposite directions. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was acknowledgement. The recognition that the story had been what it had been and was, finally, finished. People have asked me many times since, in different contexts and with different degrees of charity, whether I have regrets. I take the question seriously. The honest answer is that I regret choosing someone whose character I understood less well than I believed. I regret the 7 years, not because they were without value. My daughter was born from those years, and she is the best thing in my life. But because I gave them to something that was not equal to them. I do not regret the legal structure my father and Margaret built. It functioned as designed, and it protected what it was built to protect. I do not regret the way the ending was executed. I was fair within the boundaries of what fairness required. I was not cruel. I gave Daniel the information he needed through the channels established for exactly this purpose, and I gave him every opportunity across 7 years to look more carefully at the ground he was standing on. That he chose not to is something I have stopped trying to carry. What I do think about, sometimes, is the version of this story in which I made a different choice earlier, in which I sat Daniel down in year 1 or year 2 and said, here is who I am. Here is what my family has built. Here is the structural reality of the world we are both living inside, and I need to know whether you can love me inside of that truth, and not just inside a version of me that is easier to feel superior to. I think about whether that conversation would have changed anything. I have gone back and forth on it many times, in therapy and in my own head in the quiet of the study late at night. My conclusion, reached slowly and not without resistance, is that it might have. That there is a version of Daniel who, confronted early and directly with the full picture, might have risen to meet it, might have developed the habit of looking more carefully, might have become someone equal to the life he was living. I will never know whether that version was available. What I know is that I did not give it a full chance, partly for reasons that seemed good and were not entirely dishonest, and partly because it was easier not to. That is the thing I sit with. Not guilt exactly, more like an accurate accounting of my own choices in a story where I am not only the person who was wronged. What I know now, what all of it bought me, is something that cannot be purchased any other way. I know what I am when everything else is stripped away. I know what I will do when the situation genuinely requires it. I know the difference between patience chosen from love and patience chosen from strategy. And I know that I let those two things blur together for too long, and that the blurring was something I did, not something that was done to me, and that owning that has made me, over time, into a more accurate version of myself. My father built $2.3 billion of assets by understanding, before anyone else in every room he entered, what was real and what was performance. I spent 7 years forgetting that lesson. I will not forget it again. There is a particular kind of clarity that follows a long period of muted self-knowledge. It does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with resolution or catharsis. It simply settles in one day, the way light settles into a room after you have been away for a while and return to find everything exactly where you left it, only seen differently, the proportions adjusted, the shadows falling in different places. I noticed it first in small things, the ease with which I made decisions that had previously required considerable internal negotiation. The absence, in board meetings and investor calls, of the habitual restraint I had exercised for years. The reflexive holding back of the most precise response in favor of the more diplomatic one, as if my own sharpness were something to be managed rather than used. I had been managing myself for a long time, and the management had become so habitual that I had stopped noticing it was management and started experiencing it as personality. Getting that back, the actual personality underneath the management, was something that happened gradually and without drama, and it was, in its quiet way, the most significant thing that came out of all of it. The garden is still here. My mother's flowers come back every spring without being asked. The house is exactly what it always was, mine and my daughter's, filled now not with the particular silence of a marriage in which too much is going unsaid, but with the ordinary daily sound of a life being actually lived. I go to work. I run the trust with the seriousness it deserves and the real satisfaction that comes from doing work you understand and that matters to you. I have friends who do not recalibrate their loyalties based on asset valuations. I have time with my daughter. I have the study where my father's books are still on the shelves in the order he left them. And I have the knowledge, which distributes itself differently than any other kind of wealth, that I faced the hardest thing I have ever faced, and I did not flinch, and I did not lie, and I did not become smaller than I was. I became larger. Not in any way that required an audience, simply larger, inside myself, in the quiet way that matters most and lasts the longest. My father wrote in a letter I found after his death, tucked inside a book on his study shelf, that real power is not what you display, but what you preserve. That a woman who knows the full extent of what she carries and reveals it on her own terms is more formidable than anyone who performs their strength loudly and continuously. He wrote that he had no doubt I would understand this eventually, because people who build themselves from the inside out always do, regardless of how long it takes or how much they are underestimated along the way. I read that letter in the late afternoon, the light through the window at the particular angle it takes in autumn, and I stayed with it for a long time. He had seen me. He had always seen me, more clearly and more steadily than anyone who was supposed to love me in the years that followed. I carry that with me everywhere I go. I am Vivienne Weston. I always was. And now, with full knowledge of what that means and what it costs and what it is worth, I need no one's permission to say so.